Right now, somewhere in the world, a serial killer is walking free. Experts estimate that up to 2,000 unidentified serial killers are still at large. And right now, as you watch this video, you could be sitting near one, walking past one, talking to one. We like to think serial killers are rare, that we'd recognize them, that there's always a warning sign. But history tells a different story. Some of the most brutal killers in history walked freely among us. They had jobs, families, friends. And for years, no one suspected a thing. Why do serial killers slip through the cracks? We like to think we'd know. That if we ever stood face to face with a killer, something inside us would scream. Some instinct buried deep in our bones would tell us to run. That there'd be a look in their eyes, a shift in their voice, a feeling in the air. But time and time again, we're proven wrong. The reality is far more terrifying because serial killers don't look like monsters. They look like everyone else. They sit next to us on the train. They bag our groceries. They hold the door open with a smile. And when we see them, our brains don't register danger. Instead, they register trust. Ted Bundy understood this better than anyone. He was charming, polite. He dressed well, spoke with confidence. He could make anyone feel at ease. He was the kind of man mothers would encourage their daughters to marry. A promising law student. A friendly neighbor. The kind of guy you'd let help you carry your groceries or ask for directions if you were lost. That's how he did it. That's why they got in the car. Women trusted him. Officers believed him. Even a judge called him a waste of talent, as if his only crime was potential, not the bodies he left behind. But Ted Bundy wasn't a promising young man. He was a serial killer, a sadistic predator who preyed on young women across the United States. For years, he lured victims by faking injuries, pretending to struggle with crutches, asking for help loading books into his car. And when they got close enough, they never came back. Bundy admitted to killing at least 30 women, but experts believe the real number is much higher. He didn't just murder them, he tortured them, controlled them, kept their severed heads as trophies. And yet, even after his arrest, women still wrote him letters, showed up to his trial, smiling, hoping to catch his eye, because he wasn't a monster in their eyes. He was charming, handsome, normal. But not all killers are charming. Some don't have to be. Some don't even hide. Richard Ramirez wasn't a clean-cut law student. He was a gaunt, shadow-eyed drifter with rotting teeth and the stench of death on his skin. He didn't need a disguise. He didn't need to win anyone over, because no one suspected him to begin with. He walked freely through the streets of Los Angeles after every kill, drenched in sweat, dressed in black, blood still under his nails. He even returned to crime scenes just to watch police investigate his work. People looked at him, but no one stopped him. No one questioned him, because killers don't always hide. Sometimes they move through the world like they belong. Richard Ramirez was one of the most sadistic serial killers in history. A man with no pattern, no specific type of victim, only a thirst for suffering. He was known as the Night Stalker, a home invader, a murderer, a rapist. He left no one safe. Women, men, children, even the elderly. He killed them all, sometimes with a gun, sometimes with a knife, sometimes with nothing but his bare hands. He broke into houses in the dead of night, creeping into bedrooms, standing over his victims as they slept. And when they woke up, their nightmare had already begun. By the time he was caught, he had tortured and murdered at least 13 people. But many believe there were far more, maybe double, maybe triple. And yet, despite everything, after his arrest, he still had fans. Women sent him love letters. Some even wanted to marry him, because in their eyes he wasn't a monster. He was infamous, a celebrity, something thrilling. And then there's Jeffrey Dahmer. He wasn't charming like Bundy. He wasn't bold like Ramirez. He was just there, forgettable, unremarkable. He wasn't the kind of person who stood out in a crowd. Soft-spoken, awkward, barely making eye contact. His co-workers described him as polite but distant. Someone who showed up, did his job, and went home. His neighbors chatted with him in the hallway, borrowed sugar from him, even ate meals together, never once thinking they were sitting next to a killer. Dahmer had a routine, a stable job, an apartment filled with ordinary things. He blended in so well that even when people noticed the strange smell coming from his home, they assumed it was the food he cooked or the dead fish in his broken freezer. People had a feeling that something was off, but they brushed it off. Because Jeffrey Dahmer didn't look like a monster. He looked like just another face in the crowd, and that's exactly why no one saw him for what he really was. Dahmer wasn't just a serial killer. He was something far worse. He was a cannibal, a necrophile, a man who didn't just kill, but kept pieces of his victims. He murdered 17 young men and boys, lured them into his apartment, promising drinks, photo shoots, or just a place to rest. Once they were inside, he drugged them, strangled them, dismembered them, and then he kept them. Bones, organs, skulls, preserved in jars, stored in his fridge, arranged like some grotesque collection. And no one knew. Not his family, not his neighbors, not the police who had been inside his apartment and somehow never saw the horrors inside. Because killers don't always look like killers. They don't always growl or sneer or lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they shake your hand, flash a polite smile, speak with the kind of voice that makes you lower your guard. And when something feels off, we tell ourselves we're overreacting. But what if we're not? Hollywood has lied to us. For decades, movies have shown us what a killer should look like. Someone ugly, scarred, unhinged, a man in a mask, a villain lurking in the dark. But real killers, they don't stand out. They blend in. Ted Bundy wasn't a shadowy figure stalking victims in an alley. He was a clean-cut law student walking across campus in broad daylight, pretending to struggle with his books. He smiled. He made conversation. He looked harmless. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't fit the image of a monster. He was quiet, soft-spoken, forgettable. Neighbors passed him in the hallway, exchanged polite greetings, even shared meals with him, never realizing they were standing next to a killer. Richard Ramirez? He didn't need to hide. He walked the streets of Los Angeles, confident, composed, covered in sweat and blood, unnoticed. He returned to his crime scenes just to watch police investigate, standing in the crowd, blending in. Because no one was looking for him, and that's why they got away with it. Because charm is a weapon. Because politeness is a mask. Because fitting in is the best camouflage there is. We don't second-guess the friendly neighbor, the man who makes us laugh, who shakes our hand, who looks us in the eye and speaks with confidence. We've been trained to believe that evil is obvious, and that's exactly why it isn't. And what happens when that person never speaks? When they sit in silence? When they exist on the edges of every room, overlooked, ignored? Society has a habit of ignoring the quiet ones, the people who don't make eye contact, who don't join the conversation, who seem disconnected. They exist in the background unnoticed, and when one of them finally does something horrific, the response is always the same. He was always kind of weird. He kept to himself. I never really spoke to him, but I never thought, because no one was looking. Jeffrey Dahmer was one of them. He wasn't charming like Bundy. He wasn't bold like Ramirez. He was just there. A quiet, awkward man who barely left an impression. And because of that, no one paid attention. And then there's Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK killer. For decades, he lived a double life. To the world, he was a church leader, a husband, a father. He attended neighborhood meetings, worked as a compliance officer, scolded people for leaving their grass too long. He was ordinary. But behind closed doors, he tortured and murdered at least 10 people. He watched his victims for months before striking. He took his time. And when he was finally caught, his neighbors were stunned. But he was so normal. He was so quiet. He just minded his own business. That's the problem. Because we don't just ignore warning signs. We ignore the people who make us uncomfortable. The ones who don't fit in. The ones who keep their heads down, who live in the background, unnoticed. And sometimes that silence is hiding something. Catching a killer isn't just about uncovering clues. It's about recognizing danger before it's too late. But time and time again, the people who should have stopped them didn't. Not because the killers were too smart, not because they were invisible, but because of failures on our end. Because of fatal mistakes made by those who should have stopped them. Law enforcement errors, social biases, and systemic failures have allowed some of the most brutal killers in history to continue their crimes long after they should have been caught. Here are 3 chilling cases where killers slipped through the cracks, and innocent lives were lost because of it. Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't an invisible killer. He was caught multiple times, and yet each time he was let go. The most devastating failure happened in 1991, when police officers unknowingly handed a victim back to him. On May 27, 1991, a 14-year-old boy named Conorak Synthosamphone was found naked, bleeding and barely conscious on the streets of Milwaukee. 3 concerned women called the police, pleading for help. But when officers arrived, they dismissed the situation. Dahmer approached calm and composed and told them the boy was his boyfriend, just drunk and confused after an argument. The officers believed him. The women tried to intervene, insisting something was wrong. They pointed out the boy was terrified, unable to speak, and clearly underage. But the officers ignored them and escorted Conorak back into Dahmer's apartment. Less than an hour later, he was murdered. When police finally arrested Dahmer 2 months later, they discovered severed heads in his fridge, human organs in his freezer, and a collection of bones and photographs documenting his crimes. They realized that Conorak had been a missed chance to stop him. But what makes this even worse? 3 years earlier, Dahmer had already been convicted of sexually abusing another teenage boy from the exact same family. Despite this, he served only 10 months in jail before being released early. By the time authorities realized their mistake, 17 people were dead. Serial killers don't always operate in secrecy. Sometimes they are reported again and again, but no one listens. This is what happened in one of Canada's most horrifying cases. For decades, women were disappearing in Vancouver. Many of them were sex workers from the downtown east side, a poor and marginalized community. Their families filed missing persons reports. Activists raised concerns, but law enforcement did nothing. Why? Because their victims were overlooked by society. The missing women were dismissed as runaways, drug addicts, or simply not important enough to investigate. Meanwhile, Robert Pickton, a pig farmer with a disturbing reputation, continued killing. He lured women to his farm, where he brutally murdered them, butchered their bodies, and allegedly disposed of remains by feeding them to his pigs. It is believed that he even processed human remains through a meat grinder, possibly selling contaminated meat to the public. The most chilling part: in 1997, police had a chance to stop him. One of his victims escaped, bleeding from stab wounds. She told officers that Pickton had attacked her. He was arrested but released on bail. The charges were later dropped. He continued killing for another 5 years. By the time authorities finally took action in 2002, forensic teams found the DNA of 33 different women on his farm. However, investigators believe his real victim count may be closer to 65. Pickton himself boasted in jail that he had murdered 49 people and had wanted to kill one more to make it an even 50. A serial killer was right in front of them, but because of biases against his victims, law enforcement ignored the evidence until it was far too late. Sometimes authorities don't just miss a killer. Sometimes they literally have them in custody, only to let them go. One of the most shocking cases involved Ed Kemper, the 6'9" co-ed killer. Throughout the early 1970s, female students from California were vanishing. Their bodies were later discovered in gruesome conditions, beheaded, dismembered, and mutilated. At the same time, Kemper, a former psychiatric patient with a disturbing criminal history, frequently visited police officers at a local bar. He even had friends in law enforcement, joking with them about the disappearances. Nobody suspected him. Then, in 1973, he killed again, this time his own mother. After murdering her, he drove 1,000 miles away to Nevada, expecting to be caught. But when no one even noticed she was missing, he made a chilling decision. He called the police himself. At first, they didn't believe him. Kemper had to confess multiple times before they finally took him seriously. He was arrested and later convicted of 10 murders. But what makes this case so disturbing? Years earlier, he had already been institutionalized for murdering his own grandparents at age 15. Psychiatrists eventually declared him rehabilitated and released him. Had they kept him locked away, those 10 victims might still be alive. These cases aren't just isolated failures. They reveal a disturbing pattern of missed opportunities, ignored warnings, and lives lost because of systemic failures. Time and time again, police dismissed clear warning signs, believing the killer's words over undeniable evidence. Victims were handed back, reports were ignored, and chances to stop the murders were wasted. Many of these crimes could have been prevented, but law enforcement deprioritized cases involving sex workers, runaways, and marginalized groups. When victims were seen as less important, their disappearances weren't investigated with urgency. The killers knew this. They killed in society's blind spot. They targeted the ignored, the overlooked, because they understood that no one was really looking for them. Bias in law enforcement isn't just about which victims are ignored. It's also about who gets the benefit of the doubt. A well-dressed, educated man is less likely to be seen as a threat. A polite explanation is more readily believed. That's why killers like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer were given second chances. Even when the evidence was right in front of officers, Bundy was stopped multiple times with weapons in his car. Each time he was let go. Dahmer was literally caught with a bleeding drug teenager trying to escape his apartment. He convinced the police it was just a lover's quarrel. They believed him. They walked away. Even when serial killers had a violent criminal past, they were often released early, given second chances, and declared rehabilitated. Despite their history, despite the red flags, the system let them go. Authorities had the information, the proof, and the opportunity to stop them, but they didn't. And as a result, the killers kept hunting. It's not just that they slipped through the cracks, it's that society leaves the cracks wide open. Each case should have ended sooner. Each victim should have been saved. But instead, the killers walked free because the system allowed them to. Because someone looked at them and thought, he doesn't seem like a monster. And that mistake cost lives. Statistically, you have already crossed paths with a murderer. They work ordinary jobs. As nurses, security guards, maintenance workers, even ice cream truck drivers. They blend in because society assumes monsters look a certain way. And because of that, they go unnoticed. The reality isn't just that serial killers exist. The reality is that we choose not to see them. Think back to someone who gave you an uneasy feeling once. Someone who stared too long. Someone who made you nervous for no reason at all. What if you were right? How many times have you dismissed a gut feeling? Maybe you shouldn't. Tell us, have you ever had a chilling encounter with someone who felt off?